Alright, here we go. This is a Chapter 13 lecture for APUSH on Jacksonian Democracy, dealing with the events of the Andrew Jackson Presidency. First thing we're going to look at before we get to the events of Jackson's presidency is a concept called New Democracy and some of the reasons why this came about. New Democracy, just remember, just basically means more people are involved in the process, more people are allowed to vote. So we're going to look at some of the reasons why this occurred and how it affected the election and the presidency of Jackson. The first thing we're going to look at as to why this new democracy came about is the change in voting requirements in the early 1800s. As you can see from the map on the left, to be able to vote in 1800, most states and most territories required that you had to own property, as you can see right here. As we move forward to 1830, you can see it shifts over more to taxpayer qualifications. In other words, to be able to vote, all you had to do was be able to pay taxes. You didn't have to own property or anything like that. For our purposes, as you can see, Tennessee is still holding to this property qualification thing. Now, the bottom line on it, what it did is it opened up a lot more people, particularly in the West, as the Indiana Territory and Northwest Territory become the states of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. It opened up a lot more people into the democratic process, or in other words, to be able to vote. Another change that brought about this new democracy is a change in the perception of government. Now, if we go back a little bit to what we've talked about previously, Jeffersonian democracy was seen as government for the people. The government worked for them. Jacksonian democracy that we're going to talk about during this era right here is seen to be government by the people. And part of that is because of the persona and the image that Andrew Jackson had. He was seen as a common man. He was seen as one of the people who was voting. The reasons for this were a couple. Number one, he wasn't college educated. He didn't have the overall education that the previous presidents before him had had. Also, he was a self-made man. He didn't come from money. He made his own way in the world and rose himself up to the position he was in. And also, he was a war hero. So there were a lot of components to Andrew Jackson that regular people could identify with during his time. And we'll look at, as we go through this lecture, how those things manifested themselves or whether he lived up to the image that was portrayed or that people perceived of him. The next thing that plays into this is the Panic of 1819. Now, the Panic of 1819 is pretty significant because this is our introduction to how economics works. All right, this is the first time we had been involved in or participated in or been affected by the ups and downs of the standard economic markets. We didn't really have to deal with that before because as a colony of Great Britain, we were kind of impervious to that. We didn't really have to worry about it. But when this happens, people start to believe that they have to become more politically involved to steady out the economy or to reform banks. And the reason they felt they had to get involved is because there's a lot of foreclosures, there's a lot of bankruptcies and things going on at this time. So it involves, once again, more people getting involved in the political process. The next thing on our list is the Missouri Compromise. Now, the Missouri Compromise is significant for a couple of reasons. One, it ties into this new democracy and more people getting involved in the political process. Two, it's one of the first vivid examples of sectionalism that begins to crop up in America. And we're going to talk about this concept of sectionalism all the way up to Christmas with the Civil War. Here's the way it goes. Missouri wants to come in as a state. People are like, cool, all right, we're going to do this. So they passed something called the Talmage Amendment, which says you can come in, but you're not going to be a slavery state. There's going to be no slaves in the state of Missouri. Well, the South kind of goes nuts over this because it's going to throw off the sectional balance in Congress. In other words, there's going to be more non-slave states than slave states, and that's going to take power away from the South. So they cause a big ruckus about it and everything, and what they end up doing with the Missouri Compromise, and compromise is the key word here, is Maine's going to come in as a slave state, Maine is going to come in as a state, but it's going to be non-slavery, okay? So that's going to keep the sectional balance. In other words, there's going to be the same number of senators from non-slave states and slave states. Also, they draw this line right here at the 3630 line, which says that's it. No more slavery in any territories or any states that come up above this line. Okay, so they're trying to keep some kind of a balance when it comes down to it and all that. And lastly, there's three more things that tie into this new democracy. First of all is a two-party system. We now have two sets of candidates from very well-defined or relatively well-defined parties that are going to be in every presidential election. Also, there's an increase in voter turnout, stemming once again from the change in the qualifications to be able to vote, and also the demise of the caucus system, which we'll talk about in class a little more in-depthly. So let's go from there to how Jackson actually gets into office. Now, he doesn't make it on his first try to it through something called the corrupt bargain, which is what we're going to handle first. So he has to sit out a few years before he actually comes into power and becomes president. So here's the deal. The election of 1824, we've got four main candidates that are running for president. We have one, Henry Clay, who will be in and out of everything that we talk about for the next several years because he was in the Senate for 50 years. You got John Quincy Adams, obviously a legacy. His dad, John Adams, was president, part of the Revolution and all that. You got John C. Calhoun, who we'll talk about off and on throughout the next several chapters. And then Andrew Jackson sitting on his horse, as you can see right here, with his image of a war hero. So, when that happens, normally what occurs is you get kind of a muddling of the vote. You got four very prominent people running for the office of president in 1824. So, next we'll look at the results and how this stuff kind of worked itself out. So the election of 1824 goes down, and it looks like Andrew Jackson has got this thing wrapped up. If you look at the map on the right here, you can see he ends up with 99 electoral votes, which is more than anybody else is there. The problem comes in during this time. You not only had to win the Electoral College to be president, you also had to win a majority of the popular vote. So you had to win 50.1%, excuse my horrible writing there, but 50.1% of the popular vote when it came down to it. Well, he doesn't do this. So what happens when that occurs is that it then goes to the House of Representatives, and they're there to choose who's going to be the next president, regardless of votes, regardless of anything, as you'll see coming up. So the election goes to the House of Representatives. Now, here's where things get a little controversial. Henry Clay, who had been in the election and finished fourth in the race for president, is the Speaker of the House. So technically, he's in charge of this whole shebang when they decide who's going to win the thing. Clay detested Jackson, hated him on every level. Alright, hate's maybe a little bit of a stronger word. Let's just say he strongly disliked him. So, Clay's doing all this maneuvering to do anything in his power to make sure that Jackson will not win the presidency. So, he works this stuff all the way through, and at the end of the day, it ends up with John Quincy Adams winning the presidency through the votes from the House of Representatives. Now, where it gets a little less controversial once again is the fact that once John Quincy Adams becomes president, he appoints Henry Clay as Secretary of State. Now, Secretary of State was seen as the stepping stone or the last step on the road to the presidency at this time. So, he's setting up his boy in return for him making him president. Jackson's supporters go nuts. They start yelling it's a corrupt bargain, it's a bunch of BS, however you want to put it, but nonetheless, this thing ends up just being incredibly controversial. So before we actually get to the main event of this lecture in Andrew Jackson, let's look for a second, and I do mean literally a second, at the presidency of John Quincy Adams. It's going to be characterized by unpopular policies and other things that just kind of make him, I hate to say skip-worthy, but it's kind of the way it is, especially for this course. Alright, I'm just going to give you 1 second to just soak in this picture. It has nothing to do with it, but I feel like y'all need a little break to look at a kind grandfatherly soul staring at you, hopefully taking notes right now. So the hallmark of Adams' presidency is unpopular policies, and there's three main ones you need to worry about. First of all, it's his system of national roads, canals, etc., which is based on the American system promoted by Henry Clay. The bottom line on Adams when it comes to policies like this is that he believed in an extremely bold economic role for the federal government. In other words, they had to be extremely involved in everything that happened. The problem is people at this time, he hadn't caught up to popular opinion, because at this time people just didn't go for that at all. Also, there was some controversy with his land policies and also Indian protection, particularly in the fact that he overturned a treaty signed with the Creek Indians in 1825 dealing with their land stuff. He believed that it was a coerced treaty, it was signed under threats and all this, and basically what happened is the Creeks signed this treaty giving up their land. Well, Adams goes, no, we're not going to do that. So he overturns it and all that kind of stuff. Now, Americans disagree with it at this point because there's a big land grab going on. They're trying to get as much as possible. So they believe that any treaty signed with the Indians where they gain land was a good idea. So they're kind of all phoning with that as well. Moving from there to the election of 1828, which is the main focus of this. And it'll deal with Jacksonian democracy with both politics and relations with Native Americans. First thing we're going to look at is where the center of population in the country is during the era of Jackson. As you can see, look, we're not really talking about the West at this point as you think about, but during Jackson's During Jackson's elections and presidency, you can see the center of population of the United States, which means half the people live on this side, half the people on this side, has moved significantly west from the time when the country was founded. So along with that come different interests, concerns, etc., that more or less take away some power or some influence from the Northeast and from places like Massachusetts, New York, and all this, and you start to see more issues and more common people, once again, with that new democracy come into play, which leads to Jackson getting elected. Brief look at the 1828 Electoral Map. As you can see, Jackson did not have to worry about it going to the House of Representatives this time because he wins 178 of the electoral votes and 56% of the popular vote. So now we can get to kind of the meat of this lecture and his policies and all those kinds of things. So we're going to break down Jacksonian democracy into two different things. And the first thing we're going to look at is politics. After that, we'll move on to the economic policies and the things that he had to deal with while he was president. First thing we're going to look at is the spoil systems. Jackson was a believer that there were too many career politicians in Washington, D.C. He felt like people had gotten too comfortable. They were insulated in their own bubble, and they lost touch with the public or the common man. So to kind of remedy that, he instituted and believed in something called the rotation system, or rotation of office, in which you get people out with each new administration that comes in. In other words, you get to put your boys or your own people into public office when you win an election. It's got its good things, the bad things, and the consequences. For our purposes, number one, it led to a lot of scandal and a lot of incompetence because people were put in jobs that they weren't necessarily qualified for. Next is Jackson's kitchen cabinet. It was a group of unofficial advisors that he had that came in and kind of bounced around policy issues or public things that were going on with him in a series of informal meetings. They'd meet from time to time and kind of bounce around the big issues and things that were going on in D.C. and with the government. His critics came out, and remember, there's a lot of Jackson critics as we go throughout this thing. They said it was not right that he had an unofficial group of people who helped him out in running the government because they were not answerable to Congress. In other words, they couldn't be held accountable for the things that they did. So now we move to one of the largest issues that comes up during Jackson's initial term, and it's the Tariff of 1828, or as it becomes to be known, the Tariff of Abominations. And we'll look for a second on how it got to get that name. Alright guys, remember this starts off and it all has to do with tariffs. And remember from previous conversations, a tariff is nothing more than a tax on an imported good. There are pros and cons to these things from our point of view. The pro of it, or the good things, is that when we do this, American companies receive protection from English competition. In other words, it gives them a little heads up or a little advantage in selling goods to the American people. The bad side of it, or the con, is that it eventually ends up driving up prices, and it also invites payback tariffs, which can lead to an economic war down the line. Now, no shots being fired or anything like that, but you don't want to get in an economic war with an industrial country at this time, particularly us, because remember, we're still more or less trying to figure all this stuff out. So the Tariff of 1828 comes out, and it automatically pisses off Southerners for a couple of reasons. Number one is just the general economic circumstances of the nation at this time. The South feels like they're being left behind anyway in the broad view of it, not even having anything to do with this tariff. And it's because the North has an incredibly booming manufacturing process going at this time that we're going to look at in the next chapter. At the same time this is going on, the West, property values are going sky high through the roof because of all the expansion and things that we're doing as a nation. While all this is happening, the South is still chilling out like they are before with the plantation system based on cotton and slavery and all this, so they see themselves being kind of left behind in the race to make money on a sectional basis. Number two, the tariff is completely benefiting the Northerners because it's put in as a protection against British cloth producers. Now, when this happens, it's good for the North because their factories are able to sell more finished product when it comes to cotton. But on the flip side, the South is getting blasted on it because the English producers are not able to sell as much, so they don't need as much cotton, so they're not buying as much from the South. So while we're helping the North, it's kind of inversely impacting the South. So all this anger that the South is feeling manifests itself in a written work called the South Carolina Exposition by John C. Calhoun, who, as you can see from the bottom, is right here, and not to be confused with former WWE champion Edge or Sweeney Todd, because they kind of have all visual similarities. Nonetheless, Calhoun writes this thing, and basically what he says is that if a state finds a national law detrimental to its interest, in other words, if it doesn't help them out and it severely impacts them or hurts them, they have the right as a state to nullify the law. They have a right to void it, to just basically get rid of it and not follow it. So here's what happens at the end of the day. South Carolina decides that yeah, A, they're going to nullify this law, and B, if the federal government doesn't like it, then they're just going to leave, all right? They threaten secession. They threaten removing themselves from the Union. In response to this, Jackson raises an army and is basically prepared to go down and enforce this law by any means necessary, including military or whatever it is. So we've got to get together and we've got to find some kind of compromise or something to make sure none of these things happen. So at the end of the day, Congress gets together once again, like they always have up to this point, and they come up with a compromise. And this compromise was led by a guy that we've talked about quite a bit, Henry Clay. So what they did is they revised the tariff with a compromise bill, which institutes the Tariff of 1833, which reduces the Tariff of 1828 by 10% over 8 years. So they're kind of going to ameliorate or kind of lessen the effects of this thing on South Carolina. They also put in something called the Force Bill, which says, if needed, the president can use the Army or Navy to go in and enforce tariffs that are not being respected or not being collected by the state. So both sides pretty much get what they want, and it alleviates any of this threat of secession or anything like that for now. We'll get there later. So we move from the political elements of Jacksonian democracy over to the economic things, and the first thing we're going to look at is the bank war. As far as the origins of the bank war, alright, here's the deal. First of all, Jackson does not like the Bank of the United States, and that's what BUS means, okay? So anytime you see that, we're talking about the Bank of the United States. Well, here's the deal on it. The bank is coming up for recharter in 1832. Now, they're doing it a little bit earlier than they normally would because they feel like they have a pretty good shot to just go ahead and get it passed and not worry about it and not have to have it on their plate. Well, they didn't realize, I don't think, how fully Jackson did not like the Bank of the United States because he felt it was monopolistic, he thought it was unconstitutional, and he didn't like the dude that was at the head of the bank who was named Nicholas Biddle, who we'll talk about a little bit more later. So basically, he vetoes the charter of it and says, no, we're not going to have it anymore. Now, the bank itself did have some strengths. Number one, it took care of bank failure, so it was a way to prop up other banks around the United States. There was kind of like solid backing behind it, I guess you could say. Number two, they issued sound banknotes or money, okay? Three, they spurred expansion because everything's coming from a centralized location. And then last but not least, it was a safe deposit for funds. You didn't have to worry about this bank going under and losing all deposits, all money, or anything like that. So even though Jackson didn't necessarily like it and had his problems with it, there were some things that kind of were propping up or helping the country at this time. So the first thing Jackson does to this Bank of the United States problem is he institutes pet banks, which were simply state banks that were used for federal deposits. In response to that, Biddle goes, no, it's not going to work, man. So he starts calling in loans and basically forces weak banks, or those that were not what we call solvent, to go under. In other words, to close their shop and people lose their deposits and all this. Jackson's second solution on this is something called specie circular, which means that public lands could only be purchased with what's called hard money. Now, anytime we talk about hard money in here, we're talking about gold and silver. We refer to soft money, we're talking about banknotes. We're talking about paper money like we have today. The problem with this is gold and silver is pretty unreliable, all right? There's not a standard supply of it and all this. So what it ends up doing at the end of the day is causing inflation, or to put it another way, the value of the money would drop compared to what you could buy. So we move on from the bank war to Indian removal. Now, Indian removal originates with what we call the 5 civilized nations of the southeastern United States. As you can see right here, you have the Chickasaw Tribe, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and Choctaw. And for the most part, our deal here is going to center around the Cherokees. Leave it to you to kind of figure out why Americans might want this land at this time, but it has to do with a lot of things that we've talked about. Cotton, plantation system, arable land, all these things. So they want to remove the Native Americans from this land, use it for their own purposes. So the first step in this process is the Indian Removal Act that was passed in 1830. Now, what it said was Indians and Native Americans at first would voluntarily leave from their land. In other words, they wouldn't force them to do it. They would kind of encourage them to leave their land. Now, in response to that, or in opposed to it, they could stay on their land if they adopted white ways, like religion, culture, the government, all these different things. So voluntary at first doesn't end up being like that at the end. The group that we're going to focus on with Indian removal is the Cherokees, because they went about trying to keep their land in a couple of ways. The first thing they did was what is the process called accommodation, which means they kind of started accommodating the white settlers of the American government by instituting the practice of private property, which was a little bit more in line with the American concept of it. Two, they instituted their own alphabet. And third, they wrote their own constitution. So they tried to do this kind of in a legal, accommodating way to the government. Well, that didn't work, all right? They then had to threaten legal action because the Georgia governor threatened to seize their lands anyway. So they're like, well, fine, we'll sue, let's take it to court. It makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where John Marshall judges or rules in the Cherokees' favor in a court case called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. What Marshall said in this is that Georgia basically has no right to the land. Well, in response to that, Georgia goes, well, screw it, we're just going to ignore it and we're going to kick them off of it anyway. And Jackson, as president, kind of does the same thing. He goes, well, that's great that you ruled on this, but we're not going to enforce this law. So we end up with the forcible removal of Cherokees from their land. And this forcible removal of the Cherokees and the route that they took on the way to Oklahoma is known as the Trail of Tears, in which 18,000 Cherokees are forcibly moved to Oklahoma with military escorts and things like that. Harsh conditions, forced marching and all this. 4,000 end up dying, numerous injured, sick, etc., and all that. We move on from there to getting Jackson out of office with the election of 1836, and once again we see a couple more political parties or factions, however you want to call it, start to spring up. And in this case, we're looking at Whigs versus Democrats in this election. Now, as far as the characteristics of each, it wouldn't be a bad idea to know some of the differences between them. The Whigs were made up of the wealthiest Americans, while the Democrats were the common people. The Whigs were traditionally Federalist or in favor of a powerful central government, while Democrats were more in favor of states' rights. Whigs wanted to reduce or get rid of the spoils system, while the Democrats were in favor of it. And the Whigs, last but not least, were cool with government involvement in moral reforms like prohibition, or as we'll call it at first, temperance, and the Democrats said the government should not be involved in the personal lives of people. Move on to the election of 1836, where the Whigs and the Democrats both ran. Now, as you can see, there were three Whigs that were running against one Democrat, Martin Van Buren, and I guess you could say that three Whigs does not equal Democrat in this election, because Van Buren goes into office with 58% of the electoral vote, 51% of the popular vote, just sneaking over that majority that he needed. To kind of wrap everything up, we'll talk about Van Buren and all that in further chapters, but to look at Jackson's legacy for a second, there were both good and bad aspects to it. As far as the good part of Jackson's legacy, he really did show strong executive leadership. I mean, this guy vetoed more bills that came to his desk than any of the 6 presidents combined before him. He was also perceived as a leader of the common people, instituting that new democracy and things like that. On the bad side of it, there were also some things as well. One was the spoil system. We talked about the corruption and ineptitude of that. Also the bank failures due to his war with Biddle. And last but not least, and probably the most lasting legacy of his presidency, was the Trail of Tears and the things that come after that. So that wraps up Chapter 13 with Jacksonian Democracy. We'll move on in the next online lecture to the Industrial Revolution in America, or the expansion of the factory system, as well as immigration.